Announced it at the dinner table, right in front of 12 people, with a smile so practiced it looked almost kind. Harold worked his whole life to build something real, my mother-in-law said, dabbing her mouth with a cloth napkin like she was in a period film. We just want to make sure Gwen understands what she's marrying into. She looked right at me when she said it, not at my daughter, at me. I put down my fork, very slowly. Let me back up, because to understand what happened that night in October, you have to understand the 10 months that came before it. My daughter Gwen had been dating Fletcher for about a year when she called me one Sunday afternoon. That particular kind of excitement in her voice I hadn't heard since she got accepted to nursing school. She said, "Mom, I think he might be the one." She said his family owned a chain of auto dealerships across 3 counties in central Ohio. She said his mother, Loretta, had already invited her to brunch. I was happy for her. I really was. Gwen had been through a rough few years. A difficult breakup, a cross-country move that didn't pan out the way she hoped, coming back to Columbus with her confidence a little bruised. She deserved someone who made her feel chosen. So when she told me Loretta had asked her to brunch, I told her to go and have a wonderful time. She came home with a strange look on her face. Not upset, exactly. More like she'd eaten something that didn't quite sit right. "She's very put together," Gwen said. "That's good." She asked me where my father went to college. I set down my coffee mug. "What did you say?" "I said he didn't. That he was a plumber. That he passed away when I was 9. She paused. She said, "Oh, how sad. Well, Fletcher has always had a soft spot for strays." I felt something cold move through my chest. I said nothing for a moment. Then I said, "Well, you don't have to see her again if you don't want to." But Gwen loved Fletcher, and Fletcher loved Gwen. And families are complicated, I told myself. Lord knows mine wasn't perfect. My own mother had a way of saying the meanest things in the sweetest voice, and I'd spent 30 years making peace with that. Maybe Loretta was just nervous. Maybe she was one of those women who sounds worse than she means. I gave her the benefit of the doubt. I shouldn't have. The first time I met Loretta in person was at a Sunday dinner at their house, a wide colonial on a cul-de-sac in Dublin, Ohio, the kind of neighborhood where every lawn looks like it's been ironed. Her husband, Harold, was a quiet man who seemed to have decided long ago that it was simply easier to agree with his wife. He shook my hand warmly. He said, "Gwen has told us a lot about you." Loretta had not said that. Loretta had said, "We've heard so much about you," in the tone of someone who had heard just enough. She was a handsome woman, maybe 65, hair colored a very deliberate shade of copper, dressed in slacks and a silk blouse on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of woman who makes casual feel like a performance. The house was full of the kind of furniture that announces itself. Heavy wood, framed portraits, a grandfather clock in the hallway that I'm fairly certain existed only to be mentioned. Dinner was fine, polished. Loretta asked me what I did, and I told her I'd been an ER nurse for 31 years and had recently retired. She nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're deciding whether a thing counts. "Gwen followed in your footsteps then," she said. "She did." How sweet. Though of course Fletcher will take care of her. She won't need to be on her feet all night once they're settled. Gwen smiled, the smile of someone who has learned to let things pass. I smiled, the smile of a woman who has held the hands of dying strangers at 3 in the morning and knows with bone-deep certainty that she does not need anyone's approval to know her own worth. But I let it go. I let it go again at Thanksgiving when Loretta commented that Gwen's mashed potatoes were a little thin and offered to show her the right way to make them. I let it go at Christmas when Loretta gave Gwen a gift card to a clothing boutique in Upper Arlington with a note that said, "Something to update the wardrobe, sweetheart. First impressions matter so much in Fletcher's world." I let it go in February when Gwen called me crying because Loretta had told her during a wedding venue tour Gwen had arranged herself that the venue felt a little budget, and perhaps they should look at places Loretta's friends had used. I let it go. I let it go. I let it go. Until the rehearsal dinner. The rehearsal dinner was at a private room in a steakhouse in downtown Columbus. White tablecloths, low lighting, a prix-fixe menu that I know for a fact Loretta had selected herself because she mentioned it 4 times. There were about 20 people. Immediate family, the wedding party, a few close friends. I was seated across from Loretta's sister, a pleasant woman named Carol who sold real estate and kept refilling my wine glass without being asked. I liked Carol immediately. Midway through the main course, Loretta stood up to make a toast. This was not on the agenda. Fletcher caught Gwen's eye across the table and gave a small, resigned shrug, which told me everything about how often this happened. Loretta held her glass and smiled at the room. Harold and I are so grateful for all of you being here, she began. Tomorrow our son marries a woman who has clearly worked very hard to make something of herself. She paused. Let that hang in the air. Gwen comes from modest beginnings, a single mother, a small house, public schools, and there's nothing wrong with that. Another pause, a tilt of the head, gracious, magnanimous. In fact, I think it's given her a real hunger, a drive, and we think that with the right family around her, with our guidance, she's going to flourish. Someone at the end of the table began a tentative clap. 1 or 2 others joined before the room realized the clap wasn't quite catching. I looked at my daughter. Her face had gone perfectly still, the way it used to when she was 8 years old and trying not to cry in public. Her eyes were fixed on the tablecloth. That stillness. That practiced, exhausted stillness. 31 years of nursing meant I knew how to keep my face calm while my entire body went on alert. I picked up my own glass. I stood up. Loretta, I said, would you mind if I added something? She blinked. She hadn't expected that. Of course, she said, because there was no graceful way to say no. I smiled at the room. I took my time. Gwen grew up in a house where we didn't have a lot of money, I said. That's true. After her father died, I worked night shifts so she could come home to a made bed and a hot meal waiting in the fridge. She wore hand-me-down winter coats until she was 13 because I was saving for her college fund. She never once complained. I looked at my daughter. She was looking at me now. What Gwen has, I continued, she built. Her nursing degree, her skills, her character, none of that came from a family name or a zip code. It came from her. And any family that's lucky enough to have her join them should understand that they are receiving something, not conferring it. The table was quiet. Loretta was smiling the smile of a woman who would have something to say about this later, in private, in a very controlled voice. But before she could redirect the moment, Carol, Loretta's own sister, let out a single clear laugh and said, "Well said. Lord knows she's right, Loretta." I sat down. Fletcher reached across the table and squeezed Gwen's hand. And I thought for a moment that maybe that was the end of it. It wasn't. I found out what I found out by accident. That's the thing about secrets in a small city. They move in circles, and sometimes a circle passes right through your kitchen. 6 weeks before the wedding, I'd been at my friend Paulette's house for our standing Tuesday coffee. Paulette had been my closest friend since we worked the same unit at Ohio Health Riverside for 12 years before I moved to a different hospital system. She knew everyone. She remembered everything. It was a quality I had always admired and occasionally feared. We'd been talking about the wedding, about Loretta's rehearsal dinner speech, about how Gwen was handling the stress of it all, when Paulette set down her mug and looked at me with a particular expression. "Can I tell you something?" she said, "and you can't repeat where you heard it." "You know me, Paulette." "I know you," she agreed, "which is why I'm telling you." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "You know I still do per diem shifts over at Mount Carmel." I nodded. 3 months ago, Harold Weston was admitted. Cardiac event, not serious. He was discharged in 2 days. But when he was processing the financial assistance paperwork, she stopped. Elaine. They qualified for the hospital's charity care program. I stared at her. The income threshold for that program is $42,000 a year for a household of 2. Paulette said quietly. They qualified. I let that sit in my mind for a long moment. Harold and Loretta Weston. The Colonial in Dublin. The grandfather clock. The silk blouses in the steakhouse and the pronouncements about correct mashed potatoes and proper zip codes. Their business, I said slowly. From what I understand, the dealership group has been struggling for the better part of 4 years. Consolidation in the market, couple of bad lease agreements. They've been servicing debts that are... She shook her head. Not small. I didn't say anything. Apparently Fletcher doesn't know, she said. They've been hiding it, keeping up appearances. She looked at me steadily. I'm telling you because Gwen is about to marry into that family, and I think she deserves to know what she's actually marrying into. I drove home very carefully. I sat in my driveway for 10 minutes before I went inside. I knew what Paulette had shared with me was protected health information, shared in confidence between friends, and that I had a responsibility to treat it as such. I was not going to walk into a room and announce Harold Weston's hospital records. That wasn't who I was, and it wasn't what Paulette had intended. But information isn't the only thing that matters. Sometimes what matters is that you know, that you carry it quietly, and you watch, and you prepare. So I prepared. A woman I knew from my years in hospital administration, her name was Judith. She handled financial compliance and knew the ins and outs of public business filings better than anyone I'd ever met, had agreed to have lunch with me that week anyway. I'd been meaning to catch up with her for months. Over a Cobb salad at a diner near her office, I mentioned very casually that I'd been wondering how a person might find out about the financial health of a privately held business. Just theoretically. Just if a person wanted to know whether a company was what it presented itself as. Judith raised an eyebrow at me. Ohio's Secretary of State, she said. Business filings are public, and if they filed for any kind of debt restructuring under a holding company, that's also public record. UCC filings. Liens. She picked up her fork. You know how to use the county recorder's website? I did. I'd used it years ago when I was executor of my mother's estate. I went home that afternoon and I spent 3 hours on my laptop. I found the holding company registered under the Weston Automotive Group. I found 4 UCC financing statements filed against the business within the last 3 years, liens held by 2 different lenders. I found a judgment filed in Franklin County for a commercial debt of just over $280,000 satisfied but only 6 months ago and only after the lenders had moved to collect. None of this was secret. All of it was public. Any person who thought to look could find it. I printed everything. I put it in a manila folder in my kitchen drawer. I told myself I was just being thorough, that maybe I'd never need any of it, that Loretta would settle down after the wedding, that Fletcher would turn out to be a good husband, that the business would recover, that everything would be fine. And then the wedding happened. It was a beautiful October day, truly beautiful, the kind of Columbus fall that makes you forgive the winters, that particular gold light that falls through turning maples and makes everything look like it matters. Gwen looked extraordinary. She'd found her dress at a small bridal shop in Clintonville, nothing that would make a magazine cover, but perfect for her, simple and clean and exactly like herself. I sat in the front row and I watched my daughter walk down the aisle, and I felt the particular ache of being a parent in that moment, the gladness and the grief mixed together. The way time folds in on itself so that you're somehow watching both the little girl in the hand-me-down coat and the woman in the wedding dress simultaneously. It was a good ceremony. Fletcher cried a little, which I appreciated. His vows were specific and genuine. Gwen's were funny and true. The reception was at a banquet hall nearby. We ate, we danced, the speeches happened, everything moved the way these things move when they're working the way they're supposed to. And then Harold handed the microphone to Loretta. I don't know if they planned it or if it was just Loretta being Loretta, that gravitational pull she had toward the center of any room. But she stood up between the entree and the cake, and she smiled at the assembled guests, and she said, I will try to get this right because I want you to understand exactly what was said. She said, as Fletcher's mother, I have one wish for this marriage, And that is for Gwen to understand the kind of legacy she is joining. The Weston name means something in this community. Harold built that from nothing, from hard work, from sacrifice, from vision, and Fletcher will carry that forward. A pause. Gwen is a sweet girl, a hardworking girl. She grew up without much, I think most of us know that, and we are so glad that she will now have the stability and standing that comes with this family. We're glad we can give her that foundation. She raised her glass. People clapped because people at weddings will clap for almost anything. I sat very still. Across the table, my friend Paulette, who had not been told about the manila folder but who knew me well enough to read what was happening in my face, placed her hand briefly on top of mine. Gwen was staring at the floral centerpiece with an expression I recognized from every hard year of her life. I stood up. "Forgive me," I said loudly enough that the room quieted. "I'd like to say something." There was a beat of uncertainty. The DJ, bless him, faded the music down. I did not have the folder with me. I didn't need it. I knew it was in it. I looked at Loretta first, not with anger. With the calm that 31 years of emergency nursing gives you, the calm that comes from having made critical decisions in 2-minute windows with very little information and very high stakes. Loretta has talked a lot tonight, and over the past year, about what the Weston family is giving my daughter, about legacy, about foundation, about standing in the community. I let that sit. I want to offer a different frame. I looked at the room. Good people, most of them. Friends of both families, a few of Fletcher's colleagues. Gwen's nursing friends from the hospital who had driven in from 3 different cities. Gwen has been taking care of people her whole life. She put herself through nursing school with loans she paid off herself. She has worked overnights and holidays and shifts that would break most people. She has held the hands of strangers at the worst moments of their lives and done it with steadiness and grace. My voice was calm. It didn't waver. She is not joining this family because she needs a foundation. She is joining it because she loves Fletcher. There's a difference. I paused. And I will say this gently but clearly because I think it needs to be said. I looked at Loretta directly. The Weston family business has had a very difficult few years. That's not a secret. It's a matter of public record in Franklin County. Liens, debt judgments, restructured lending agreements. I only know this because I looked. And I looked because I love my daughter, and I believe a mother should know what her child is actually walking into. The room had gone absolutely silent. Loretta's face had changed. Something had drained out of it, not just color, but the performance itself. "I'm not saying this to embarrass anyone," I continued. "Financial difficulty happens to good people and good businesses. There's no shame in it. But there is something worth examining in a woman who would stand at her son's wedding and speak about what her family is bestowing on a bride, while keeping quiet about the $280,000 commercial judgment that was settled 6 months ago, while accepting charity care at a hospital, while the dealerships carry liens." Someone at a table near the back coughed. "Gwen doesn't need a legacy handed to her," I said. "She built her own." And Fletcher, I looked at my son-in-law, who was sitting very still with an expression that was hard to read. "Fletcher, I think you already know that. I've seen how you look at her. Hold on to that." I picked up my glass. "To Gwen and Fletcher," I said, "to building something honest together." The room was quiet for one long moment. And then Paulette raised her glass. Then Gwen's friend from nursing school. Then Carol, Loretta's sister, wonderful Carol, who stood up fully from her chair and raised her glass and said, "To Gwen and Fletcher." And the room followed. Loretta left the reception 40 minutes later. Harold went with her. They said something to Fletcher before they left. I was across the room and couldn't hear it, but I watched his face during whatever was said, and he nodded once and did not follow them. Later, after the cake, after the dancing, after the last guest had trickled out and it was just me and Gwen and Fletcher in the lobby waiting for their car, my daughter put her arms around me and held on for a longer moment than she usually does. "You didn't have to," she said into my shoulder. "I know," I said. She's going to make the next 20 years very difficult. Probably, I said, but she was going to do that anyway. At least now she'll do it quietly. Fletcher laughed, a surprised, tired, genuine laugh. He shook his head. My mother has never in her life been told directly that she was wrong, he said. I don't know if you know what you started. I have a sense, I said. He looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw something settle in him. Thank you for loving Gwen the way you do, he said. I've been watching it all night. I'm going to try to deserve that. I thought that was one of the better things a son-in-law had ever said to a mother of the bride. I told him so. That was 2 years ago. The Weston dealership group was quietly sold to a regional consolidator 14 months after the wedding. Harold and Loretta moved to a smaller house in Westerville. Still a nice house, but a real one, not a performance. Loretta has been to 3 family dinners since then. She speaks to Gwen differently now. Not warmly, exactly, but carefully. Like someone who has learned the cost of carelessness. Fletcher is a good husband. I say that without reservation. He stood next to Gwen through 2 miscarriages and a cross-country move for her career advancement without once making her feel like she owed him for it. That is not nothing. Gwen and I talk every Sunday. She tells me about her patients. Never names, just stories. The kind of stories that remind you what human beings are capable of on their worst and best days. She sounds like herself. That's all I ever wanted. There are people who have told me I was wrong for what I did at that reception, that it was her son's wedding day, that there were better times and places, that I could have handled it privately, that I embarrassed the family, and maybe some of that is fair. But I've held the hand of a 60-year-old woman in an emergency room who finally told me for the first time in 30 years of marriage that she didn't feel like she was allowed to take up space. I have seen what happens to women who are told, slowly and consistently, that they arrived with nothing and should be grateful for whatever they are given. I was not going to let that be my daughter's story. The truth had been sitting in plain sight in public records this whole time. I didn't invent it. I didn't exaggerate it. I simply refused to pretend I didn't know it. My name is Elaine. I am 63 years old. I worked 31 years in emergency medicine, and I raised a daughter alone, and I know what a foundation actually looks like. It looks like healing up. It looks like honesty. It looks like refusing to let the people you love be made small by people who are smaller than they appear. Loretta wanted my daughter to understand what she was marrying into. Turns out we all needed to understand that. I think about Loretta sometimes, not with anger. That passed a long time ago. I think about the version of her that believed, genuinely believed, that what she was doing at that reception was a form of generosity, that announcing my daughter's modest beginnings to a room full of people was a gift, that framing herself as the one bestowing something made her powerful rather than exposed. That's the thing about self-deception. It doesn't announce itself. It just quietly rearranges the furniture until you can't see the room clearly anymore. What happened to Loretta was not punishment in any dramatic sense. There was no curse, no cosmic reckoning delivered from the outside. What happened was simply the natural consequence of building a life on performance rather than substance. The debts were real, the liens were real, the judgment was real. She had spent years constructing an image of prosperity and standing while the actual foundation eroded underneath it. And when someone finally said plainly and publicly what the record showed, the image couldn't hold. That's not fate, that's physics. I've been thinking about what it actually takes to live with integrity over a long stretch of time. Not the dramatic moments. Those are almost easy in a way, because the stakes are obvious. It's the quiet, daily decisions that shape a person. The choice to tell the truth when a comfortable lie is available. The choice to look honestly at your own circumstances rather than performing a version of them for an audience. The choice to treat another person's dignity as something real and worth protecting, even when you have the social power to dismiss it. Gwen has that. She always has. I watched her develop it the hard way, over years of hard work and honest living, and I watched Loretta try to frame it as a deficit, as if the struggle itself was the embarrassing part, rather than the proof of something real. Intelligence isn't just what you know. It's whether you're willing to actually look. I could have remained willfully ignorant about the Weston family's finances. It would have been easier, but I'd spent 3 decades in emergency medicine, and one of the first things that work teaches you is that what you don't know can hurt the people you're responsible for. So I looked. I used public records. I asked people who understood the systems. I followed the information where it led. That's not cunning. That's just the discipline of paying attention, which is something any of us can do if we decide it matters. And the courage part, the standing up part, that wasn't heroic. I want to be clear about that. It was uncomfortable. My hands were not entirely steady when I picked up that glass. But Gwen had spent the better part of a year swallowing things that should not have been swallowed, and I had watched her go still at that table with the expression I'd known since she was 8 years old. And something in me simply decided that this was the moment where silence would cost more than speaking. Fletcher told me that night that he was going to try to deserve the way I loved Gwen. I think about that often too, because what he recognized, what I hope he carries forward, is that love without honesty is just affection, and affection without the willingness to stand up when it matters is just comfort. I am 63 years old. I raised a daughter alone and worked night shifts and held strangers' hands in dark rooms, and I know with complete certainty that no one hands you your worth. You live it. You demonstrate it, day after day, in the choices that nobody sees and the ones that everybody does. Loretta wanted Gwen to understand what she was marrying into. She was right that someone needed to understand. It just turned out not to be Gwen.